January 31st, 1943. In the basement of the Univermag department store in Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sits at a rough wooden table. His uniform is filthy, his face hollow from months of starvation rations. Around him, Soviet officers wait in silence, the air thick with smoke and the stench of frozen bodies. Outside, the temperature hovers around 20 below zero. The wind shrieks through shattered windows, carrying the frozen city's deathly chill. The walls above them are pockmarked with bullet holes, blackened by flamethrowers, and still echo with the last gunshots of a battle already lost. Beyond, Stalingrad is a moonscape of ruins, the industrial heart of the Volga reduced to rubble and ash. Paulus takes a trembling breath and signs the surrender document. The pen scratches across the paper, sealing the fate of the German Sixth Army. He has held the rank of Field Marshal for just 31 hours. Hitler promoted him on January 30th, his birthday, through a radio message crackling across the frozen front. But the promotion brings no reinforcements, no supplies, no hope of survival, only an unspoken command. In the history of the German military, no field marshal had ever been captured alive. Not in the wars against Napoleon, not in the Franco-Prussian War, not even in the First World War. Each had chosen death over capture. The title of Field Marshal that day was not an honor, it was a death sentence. Hitler's message was clear: you know what must be done. Paulus understood this, and so did every officer trapped with him in the frozen ruins. Hitler had handed him a loaded pistol and pointed it to his own temple. But Paulus does not follow the script. He lays the gun down. He surrenders. And with him, what remains of the Sixth Army, 91,000 starving, frostbitten men, the ghosts of a force that had invaded Russia with 300,000 soldiers. When Hitler receives the news, he does not explode in shock. His anger is colder, sharper, the fury of a man personally betrayed. To Hitler, Paulus's surrender is not merely military failure, it is treason against the ideology of the Third Reich. In Hitler's world, a German commander dies before yielding. Any choice to survive is incomprehensible. His reaction exposes a mind incapable of valuing human life over symbolic sacrifice. And in that moment, Hitler's fragile trust in his generals begins its irreversible collapse. By late January 1943, Stalingrad had become more than a battlefield. It was a symbol of total war, of pride and delusion, and of the death of the German dream in the East. The battle had begun 5 months earlier, in August 1942, when German forces reached the Volga River and pushed into the heart of Stalingrad. For Hitler, it was meant to be a strategic step, cutting Soviet supply lines, securing the oil fields of the Caucasus, and striking a decisive blow against the Red Army. But Stalingrad was no ordinary city. Bearing Stalin's name, it carried symbolic weight, and the Soviet dictator issued a chilling command: not one step back. The city must not fall. Hitler, obsessed, turned the campaign into a personal duel. Stalingrad became less about strategy and more about pride, ego, and ideology. A test of wills between two dictators paid for by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. By November 1942, after months of brutal street fighting, German forces controlled most of the city. The Sixth Army, under Paulus, had pushed the Soviets to a narrow strip along the Volga's western bank. Victory seemed close. Soldiers could see the river. Enemy resistance was collapsing. German officers sent confident messages to Berlin, predicting total victory within days. Hitler was jubilant. He told his inner circle Stalingrad was practically won, a triumph for history to remember. Then, on November 19th, the illusion shattered. the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed to encircle, not just pierce, the German lines. Soviet tanks and infantry swept around the flanks, smashing through the thinly held Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the rear. Within days, the trap closed. The Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, was cut off in a pocket roughly 30 miles across. Stalingrad, once a symbol of German advance, had become a steel coffin. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out. His generals urged it. The window for escape was closing fast. They could have abandoned heavy weapons, fought west, and rejoined the main lines. Hitler refused. From East Prussia, he sent one order: the Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad must be held. There will be no retreat. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised the army could be supplied entirely by air. The Sixth Army needed over 700 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition daily to survive. Göring could deliver only a fraction. Soviet air and ground superiority, bad weather, and captured airfields limited deliveries to 80 to 100 tons per day, sometimes far less.
As winter deepened, starvation and frostbite claimed men by the thousands. Soldiers boiled horse meat and gnawed frozen leather belts. Fingers and toes blackened and fell away. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Wounded men froze in makeshift aid stations, begging for morphine that never came. Others died in their sleep, too weak to rise. Temperatures plunged to -30, then -40 degrees Celsius. And still, Hitler's orders were unchanged. Hold the city. Fight to the last bullet, the last man. Friedrich Paulus, 52, had spent most of his career as a staff officer, a meticulous planner, intelligent, methodical, and cautious rather than a battlefield commander. He had helped plan Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, he watched his army die while receiving impossible orders from a man 1,000 miles away. By late January, his command post was reduced to a few cold, damp rooms in the basement of the Univermag department store. His men were too weak to stand. Their weapons were frozen solid. On January 24, 1943, Paulus sent a final radio message to Hitler's headquarters. His voice was flat. Resigned. "The Sixth Army will soon cease to exist," he reported. "Request immediate permission to surrender to save the lives of the remaining troops." The Sixth Army was finished. Collapse was only a matter of days. 18,000 wounded men lay in basements and cellars with no medical supplies, no morphine, and no doctors left to care for them. The smell of death clung to everything. Men froze in their cots because there was no fuel to burn. Rations had dwindled to 2 ounces of bread per day, barely enough to survive. Horses, dogs, even wallpaper paste had been eaten. The soldiers who could still fight were too weak to hold their rifles. Once proud formations had dissolved into scattered pockets of starving survivors. The Sixth Army, Hitler's prized formation once 300,000 strong, was reduced to little more than ghosts in tattered uniforms. Recognizing the inevitability of the end, Paulus sent a final plea to headquarters. There was no ammunition, no fuel, no medicine, no hope. The only humane decision left was surrender. Hitler's reply came on January 30th, his birthday. Instead of granting permission, he promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. German radio broadcast it that afternoon. Joseph Goebbels framed it as recognition of Paulus's heroic leadership at Stalingrad. But anyone who knew the army's traditions understood the unspoken truth. It was not an honor. It was an order. In the history of the German military, no field marshal had ever been taken prisoner, not once. The message was clear. Do the honorable thing, die like a field marshal should. At his East Prussia headquarters, Hitler made the expectation explicit. Speaking to his staff, he said coldly, "There is no record in German military history of a field marshal being captured. He could have freed himself from all sorrow and descended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow." To Hitler, Paulus's duty was not to live or protect his men, but to die, a ritual act of loyalty. Survival was betrayal. Choosing life over death was a moral failure, a stain on the army, the ideology, and the myth of German invincibility. Paulus did not obey. On January 31st, Soviet forces stormed the Univermag department store, Paulus's command post. Surrounded and out of options, he ordered his staff to lay down their weapons. At 7:35 a.m., Friedrich Paulus, now a field marshal, surrendered. The following day, February 2nd, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad collapsed. The battle was over. When Hitler received word of Paulus's surrender, he was stunned. Witnesses recall him staring at the message in silence, muttering finally, "He should have shot himself, just as the old commanders did when they saw that the cause was lost. Even Varus gave his slave the order, 'Now kill me.'"
In that moment, Hitler reached back 2,000 years to invoke Publius Quintilius Varus, the Roman general who took his life after losing 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest. To Hitler, true commanders were not meant to survive defeat. They were meant to die with their armies. The comparison was delusional, but revealing. It exposed how deeply Hitler equated honor with self-destruction. For Paulus, surrender was an act of reason. For Hitler, it was treason. In the days that followed, as reports from Stalingrad continued to arrive, Hitler's fury deepened. His anger was not just at Paulus, but at the very idea of surrender. To him, yielding was spiritual rot, a moral failing, a betrayal of the nation itself. During a conference on February 1st, stenographers recorded one of Hitler's most revealing tirades. "What is life? Life is the nation. The individual must die anyway. Beyond the individual stands the nation. How can one fear this moment which frees one from misery if one's duty does not chain one to this vale of tears? No, he could have freed himself and entered eternity, national immortality. But he prefers to go to Moscow. What kind of choice is that? It makes no sense." To Hitler, surrender was not survival, it was desecration. To live was to dishonor the dead. Stalingrad was no longer just a military disaster. In his eyes, it had become a moral catastrophe. Hitler repeatedly returned to the same idea: death with honor, life with shame. In his worldview, Paulus chose wrong. There was no room for nuance, for compassion, for responsibility. Survival was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. He went even further, suggesting Paulus's decision tainted the sacrifice of everyone who died. A man like that besmirches the heroism of so many others at the last minute. Imagine that, 100,000 German soldiers, starved, frozen, and torn apart, their sacrifice deemed meaningless because their commander chose life over ritual death. Logic had no place here. This was ideology, the twisted code of a death cult where survival was shameful and obedience demanded self-annihilation. Hitler wasn't mourning the destruction of the Sixth Army. He was mourning the loss of a perfect martyrdom. If Paulus had killed himself, Stalingrad could be immortalized, a heroic last stand against impossible odds, a German Thermopylae. Instead, the surrender shattered the illusion. It made the defeat real, undeniable, human. Paulus's choice forced the world and the German people to confront the truth. Stalingrad wasn't a tale of glory. It was a catastrophic, avoidable disaster born from Hitler's own arrogance and strategic delusion. But Hitler could never admit that. In his mind, he was never wrong. Someone else had to bear the blame. That someone was Friedrich Paulus. He needed to believe it wasn't his orders that doomed the Sixth Army, but Paulus's weakness. By refusing to die, Paulus had, at least in Hitler's eyes, destroyed something far greater than himself, the myth of the invincible German will. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, shared Hitler's outrage. In his diary on February 2, 1943, the day after the final surrender, he wrote, "The Führer is deeply upset about the attitude of the Sixth Army's leaders. He had expected something different from them. They should have committed suicide rather than go into captivity. One feels very bitter about this." Goebbels wasn't mourning the soldiers' suffering. He was worried about image. How do you tell a nation that an entire army has surrendered after months of promises of victory? For months, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Stalingrad as unstoppable German courage. Newspapers called it the graveyard of Bolshevism, and newsreels celebrated honor, sacrifice, and destiny. Now, those same heroes were prisoners in Soviet hands. The illusion collapsed overnight.
The propaganda machine scrambled to rewrite reality. Public statements avoided the word surrender. Newspapers reported only that the struggle in Stalingrad has ended, or that the Sixth Army fought to the last man, as if the men had simply vanished. Friedrich Paulus's name disappeared completely, as though he no longer existed. Behind closed doors, Hitler made it official. Paulus was dead to Germany. His name was struck from military lists. His family was denied communication. No letters, no visits, no explanations. To Hitler, Paulus had committed a kind of spiritual suicide, killing his honor. In the Führer's hierarchy, that was worse than death. The truth, of course, was different. Paulus was alive, in Soviet captivity alongside 24 other generals and tens of thousands of emaciated survivors. Most would never return. Fewer than 6,000 of the 91,000 who surrendered would survive to see Germany again. Paulus was one of them. His survival haunted Hitler for the rest of his life. Every day Paulus lived, every time his name appeared in Soviet propaganda, it was a reminder of Stalingrad, the moment blind loyalty cracked, the man who refused to die for a lie. For Hitler, Paulus's survival was more than disobedience. It was defiance from beyond defeat. It proved that even in the most fanatical army on earth, the instinct to live could triumph over the command to die. And for a dictator who built his empire on obedience unto death, that was the ultimate betrayal. Paulus didn't just survive, he spoke, and that to Hitler was unthinkable. Months of silence in Soviet captivity had given him perspective. He witnessed, from afar, the Reich he had served unraveling. He learned of the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt, German officers' desperate plot to end Hitler's rule. He saw it fail, watched the conspirators hunted down, tortured, executed, displayed as traitors. The message from Berlin was clear. Loyalty demanded death, dissent meant suffering. And yet, in the cold isolation of captivity, Paulus began to question everything he once believed. The man who had once saluted Hitler without hesitation now observed the Reich destroying itself from within. Blind obedience had killed his men at Stalingrad, and he saw it repeated across Europe. The realization changed him. When approached by the Soviets to join the National Committee for a Free Germany, a group of captured officers advocating peace and the overthrow of the Nazi regime, Paulus hesitated. But the more he learned about the destruction wrought by the war, the more he realized silence would make him complicit. In August 1944, Paulus did the unthinkable. Over Soviet radio, his voice, once the voice of a Wehrmacht field marshal, called on German soldiers to stop fighting. "Lay down your arms," he urged. End this war before all of Germany is destroyed. For millions across the front, it was a shocking moment. The man Hitler had promoted to Field Marshal on the eve of Stalingrad's fall, hoping he would shoot himself rather than surrender, was now speaking for the enemy. For Hitler, it was the ultimate betrayal. The symbol of sacrifice he had wanted had become a symbol of defiance. Paulus hadn't just betrayed Hitler personally, he had shattered the mythology of the Third Reich. Death for the Führer, the highest honor? Paulus had chosen life. Hitler raged privately, calling him a coward, a disgrace to the uniform. But was Paulus truly a coward? Or was Hitler's demand monstrous? Think about what Hitler expected. He wanted Paulus to die, not to save his men, not for any military gain, not even for strategy. The battle was already lost. There was no line to hold, no objective to capture. Hitler demanded Paulus's death simply to preserve a myth, to turn catastrophe into legend, to cover his own failures with a theatrical gesture. Paulus refused. He chose to live out of duty to the thousands still under his command. His surrender spared 91,000 from senseless slaughter in the ruins of Stalingrad. Most would die later in Soviet captivity. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion claimed tens of thousands. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. But had Paulus obeyed Hitler's order to fight to the last man, none would have survived. That single act, choosing life over myth, broke Hitler's illusion of total control, and that illusion would never recover.
In captivity, Paulus became something Hitler could never be: self-aware. He began to understand that blind loyalty without conscience leads only to ruin. During the Nuremberg trials after the war, he appeared as a witness, providing crucial evidence about Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union and the crimes committed under the regime he had once served. He described the military hierarchy, the pressures, and the blind obedience that had fueled genocide. His testimony helped expose the very system that had demanded he die. And then there was his final act of defiance: to live. Paulus spent his remaining years quietly in East Germany, in Dresden. He never returned to West Germany, perhaps knowing he would forever be branded a traitor by some, a coward by others. Yet history remembers him differently, not as a man who surrendered out of weakness, but as one who refused to surrender his humanity. He died in 1957, 14 years after the man who had expected him to die in a bunker. Other generals at Stalingrad made different choices. Some, like General Heitz and General von Seydlitz, shot themselves as the Soviets closed in. Others ordered the burning of maps and flags before taking cyanide. They adhered to Hitler's cult of death, the belief that dying for the Führer was nobler than living with defeat. Their names are barely remembered, footnotes in history. Paulus's name endures precisely because he chose differently. Hitler's fury at Paulus wasn't simply disobedience, it was fury at reality itself. The surrender forced him to confront Stalingrad for what it truly was, not a heroic last stand, but a monumental failure born from his own arrogance. It revealed the fatal flaw at the core of his leadership. Pride mattered more than life. Before Stalingrad, Hitler occasionally listened to his generals, even allowed some flexibility. After Paulus's surrender, that changed. Something inside him snapped. His paranoia deepened, his trust evaporated. From that moment on, he believed that only he had the will to win, that every general was a potential traitor. Stalingrad didn't just destroy an army, it destroyed Hitler's faith in his own military. And in a strange way, Paulus's survival became the ghost that haunted him, a constant reminder of his failure. Every day that Paulus lived was silent proof that Hitler's code of death before dishonor was a lie. Because in the end, Paulus did what Hitler never could. He faced defeat, accepted it, and lived with it. He was wrong. What he called weakness was sanity. What he called lack of will was recognition of reality. Paulus's choice to surrender rather than commit suicide was not cowardice. It was the last sane act of a man trapped in a system gone completely mad. It was a refusal to participate in a death cult that valued symbolism over humanity, that demanded death as proof of loyalty. Hitler couldn't see that. He wasn't capable of seeing it. In his mind, Paulus had committed the ultimate sin, choosing life over honor. But in Hitler's twisted moral universe, honor no longer meant courage, leadership, or integrity. Honor meant death. Honor meant silence. Honor meant obedience until the last breath. Even that obedience dragged hundreds of thousands of men into the grave for nothing. In that world, to admit defeat was shameful, to question orders was treason, and to live after failure was the ultimate disgrace. When Hitler learned that Paulus had surrendered instead of shooting himself, his reaction wasn't sorrow, it was rage. He told his staff that Paulus had betrayed not just Germany, but the dead themselves, that he had stained the sacrifice of every soldier who fell at Stalingrad. He should have freed himself from all sorrow and descended into eternity and national immortality. In Hitler's mind, Paulus's death would have made Stalingrad a legend. His survival made it a disaster. But beneath the rhetoric, the message was simple. Hitler needed Paulus dead so he could pretend the disaster wasn't his fault. Paulus refused. He chose life, and in doing so, he shattered the illusion Hitler had built. His surrender exposed the truth Hitler tried desperately to hide, that the Sixth Army hadn't been defeated for lack of courage, but because the Supreme Commander ignored reality. Paulus's survival made that truth undeniable.
His surrender wasn't weakness. It was defiance, more powerful than any suicide could have been. It left no room for myth. It forced Hitler to see Stalingrad not as a story of heroism, but as catastrophic failure. It revealed that his obsession with no retreat and victory or death had annihilated one of Germany's most powerful armies. His empire, built on fantasies of invincibility, collapsed the moment reality arrived. Hitler called Paulus a coward, but courage isn't dying when death is easy. Courage is living when you know you'll be branded a coward for it. Courage is facing shame, scorn, and exile, because the alternative is dying for a lie. Paulus's decision wasn't glamorous. It didn't fit into the Reich's mythology. It was quiet, exhausted, almost pitiful, but it was human. And that was what Hitler couldn't tolerate. The humanity of it. That a German officer could value life after defeat. That he could see his men as people rather than symbols. After Stalingrad, Hitler's hatred of Paulus hardened into paranoia. He forbade his officers even to speak the Field Marshal's name. In official records, Paulus was erased, a non-person. His family was ostracized, their letters unanswered. In Hitler's eyes, Paulus had already committed suicide, not of the body, but of the soul. He had killed his honor. Yet the more Hitler tried to erase him, the more Paulus's shadow lingered. Every time a German general hesitated to obey a suicidal order, Hitler saw Stalingrad. Every time a commander questioned a hopeless defense, he thought of Paulus. The specter of that surrender haunted every map, every meeting, every decision in the Führer's bunker. For 2 years after Stalingrad, Hitler refused to promote another field marshal. The rank had become contaminated, poisoned by association with disobedience. When he finally did appoint new field marshals, it was bitter and laced with warnings. Remember what happened to Paulus. Do not disappoint me the way he did.
It was less a promotion than a death sentence wrapped in ceremony. But Hitler learned the wrong lesson. He thought Stalingrad proved his generals were weak. The truth was the opposite. Ordering men to die for nothing wasn't strength. It was failure, cowardice disguised as conviction. Paulus's decision exposed that truth. By living, he stripped the myth of honor and death of all its power. He showed that sometimes the bravest act is to stop obeying, to look at the horror one helped create and to say, no more. When the war ended and the Reich lay in ruins, Paulus's survival gained strange significance. He had lived through the system that demanded his death. He had witnessed its rise, served its ambitions, and outlived its fall. His life became proof that conscience, though buried under fear and obedience, could still endure even inside the machinery of totalitarianism. Hitler died the way he expected Paulus to, trapped, delusional, and afraid, taking his own life in a bunker beneath a city of ashes. Paulus, by contrast, died quietly in 1957 in a small house in Dresden, haunted by the ghosts of Stalingrad, but unbroken by them. History rarely remembers those who die on command. It remembers those who live in defiance of it. In the end, Hitler's empire was built on death. Paulus's surrender, his refusal to die for that empire, was the first crack in its foundation. Stalingrad destroyed the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility. Paulus's surrender shattered Hitler's vision of the heroic German soldier, the soldier who would rather die than admit defeat. Hitler's reaction revealed the moral rot at the core of the Nazi regime, a system that worshipped death, mistook delusion for courage, and replaced truth with spectacle. For Hitler, life had meaning only when it could be sacrificed for his vision. Death was not tragedy, it was theater. Every corpse was a prop in his national drama. When Paulus chose survival, he disrupted that script. He chose reality over myth, reason over madness. And for that, Hitler never forgave him.
Hitler didn't want heroes. He wanted martyrs. He didn't want victory. He wanted destruction, a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods, where Germany would die gloriously rather than live imperfectly. He wanted flames, ruin, annihilation, a theater to glorify his failure. Paulus refused to burn, and for that, Hitler condemned him as a coward. But history remembers differently. Paulus lived to see the Reich that demanded his death collapse in on itself. He saw its symbols reduced to rubble, its leaders dead or in chains. He lived long enough to testify about what he had seen, about the madness that turned patriotism into fanaticism and duty into suicide. Hitler died in a bunker, still giving orders to ghosts, still clinging to fantasies of honor and destiny, while the empire he built crumbled above him. So who was the coward? The man who surrendered to save what lives could still be saved, or the man who demanded death to protect his pride? Hitler's words about Paulus's surrender stand as a monument not to bravery, but to the sickness of a system that confused loyalty with self-destruction. They reveal a mind that could not imagine any virtue higher than obedience, any courage greater than dying on command. And they remind us of something vital. Sometimes the most courageous act a person can take is the one that looks like cowardice to those who worship death. Paulus chose life in Hitler's Germany. That was the ultimate betrayal, and in human terms, it was the ultimate sanity.